Traffic is terrible. I'll be home in about 40 minutes. My husband texted me at exactly 5:17 that Tuesday afternoon. If I hadn't been standing less than 10 feet away from him when my phone vibrated, I probably would have believed every single word. Instead, I watched him slip his phone back into his jacket pocket, smile at the woman standing beside him, and gently open the restaurant door for her as if there wasn't a wife waiting at home who had spent nearly 28 years building a life with him. My name is Helen Brooks. I'm 64 years old, and until that moment I believed my marriage was one of those quiet success stories people rarely talk about because nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Scott and I had raised 2 wonderful children, celebrated countless birthdays, survived layoffs, illnesses, aging parents, and every ordinary challenge life had placed in front of us. We were never the loud couple at family gatherings. We weren't the couple posting romantic vacations online every weekend either. We were simply steady, reliable, comfortable, or at least that was the story I kept telling myself. That afternoon, I had driven into downtown Seattle to buy a birthday gift for my oldest granddaughter. She had recently fallen in love with watercolor painting, and I knew of a small art supply store tucked between an old bookstore and a coffee shop near Pioneer Square. Parking downtown had always been a little frustrating, so when I finally found a space in the public garage, I remember feeling oddly victorious over something so small. I stepped out of my car carrying my purse and reusable shopping bag, thinking about what color brushes she might enjoy most. My day was ordinary in every possible way until I heard a familiar laugh echo through the concrete structure. It wasn't just any laugh. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, you recognize certain sounds without even thinking. Scott had a habit of laughing with his whole face before the sound ever escaped his mouth. His shoulders relaxed first, then his eyes narrowed slightly, and only then would the laugh arrive. I turned my head almost automatically. There he was. My husband stood only a few parking spaces away. His navy sport coat was the same one I had pressed that morning before he left for what he called an important client meeting. Beside him stood a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair wearing a cream-colored jacket and carrying a leather tote bag. They looked completely comfortable together. The kind of comfort that only comes from spending time with someone without watching the clock. Scott leaned closer as she spoke, smiling in a way I realized I hadn't seen directed toward me in a very long time. My phone buzzed in my hand. His message appeared across the screen. Traffic is terrible. I'll be home in about 40 minutes. For a few seconds, everything around me became strangely quiet. The distant sound of engines, footsteps, elevator doors, and conversations all seemed to fade into the background. I didn't feel the dramatic rush of anger people always describe in movies. I didn't cry. I didn't march across the garage demanding answers. I simply looked up from the glowing screen to the man who had just lied to me while standing close enough for me to notice the tiny crease near his left eyebrow whenever he smiled. He never saw me. Neither of them did. They walked toward the restaurant entrance, still talking, completely unaware that I had become an invisible witness to a truth I had never gone looking for. I could have followed them inside. I could have called his name. I could have confronted him right there between rows of parked cars. Instead, I slowly slipped my phone into my purse, turned around and walked back toward my own car. As I reached for the driver's door handle, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked exactly the same as I had an hour earlier, yet somehow I felt like a stranger looking back at myself. That was the moment my marriage quietly ended, not with shouting, not with tears, but with a simple text message that collapsed under the weight of the truth standing only 10 feet away. I drove home that evening using streets I had traveled thousands of times before, yet nothing looked familiar anymore. Every traffic light seemed to last longer than usual. Every stop sign gave me another excuse to sit quietly with my hands resting on the steering wheel, while my mind searched desperately for a reasonable explanation that would make everything I had just seen disappear. Perhaps there had been a business meeting after all. Perhaps she was a client. Perhaps I had misunderstood a simple moment between colleagues. Those thoughts came and went within minutes because they all collapsed beneath one undeniable fact. Scott had lied to me before I had ever questioned him. The lie had arrived first. The explanation had never been requested. That was what stayed with me more than anything else. When I pulled into our driveway, the flower beds along the front porch looked exactly as they always had. I had planted those white hydrangeas nearly 12 years earlier, because Scott once told me they reminded him of the neighborhood where we bought our first home. I unlocked the front door, placed my purse on the kitchen counter, and began preparing dinner out of habit rather than hunger. I rinsed vegetables, sliced carrots, and placed chicken breasts into a baking dish with the same careful movements I had repeated for decades. Routine can be a strange kind of comfort. Sometimes your hands remember what your heart cannot accept. At 6 o'clock the house remained silent except for the ticking clock above the refrigerator. At 6:30 I poured myself a glass of iced tea and looked through the window toward the backyard. The maple tree we planted when our son graduated from high school had grown tall enough to cast a wide shadow across the lawn. Time had quietly changed everything around me, while I believed some things would remain untouched forever. At 6:58 the garage door opened. I heard Scott step inside carrying his laptop bag. He walked into the kitchen with the same relaxed smile he had worn almost every evening for years. He leaned over, kissed my forehead gently, and apologized for being late because traffic had been backed up across downtown. The words landed softly, almost casually, as though they had been rehearsed during the drive home. I looked directly into his eyes and realized something I never imagined I would have to learn after 28 years of marriage. A person can become remarkably comfortable repeating a story when they believe nobody has witnessed the truth. I simply nodded and asked whether he wanted mashed potatoes or rice with dinner. He looked surprised that I had not asked another question. Maybe he expected curiosity. Maybe he expected mild frustration. Instead, I offered him the same quiet kindness I had always given him, and that seemed to reassure him more than any conversation could have. During dinner, he talked about upcoming meetings, quarterly reports, and a possible business trip later that month. I noticed details I would have ignored only one day earlier. He kept his phone face down beside his plate. Every few minutes the screen lit up silently, but he never reached for it while I was looking. He complimented the meal twice, laughed at a story on the evening news, and asked whether our daughter had called about the grandchildren. Everything sounded perfectly ordinary. That was the unsettling part. Ordinary conversations can hide extraordinary secrets when both people sitting at the table are living inside completely different versions of reality. Later that night, after Scott had fallen asleep beside me, I remained awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every small change I had dismissed over the past several months. The unexpected late meetings. The growing number of business dinners. The weekends when he claimed exhaustion but somehow always found energy for work on Monday morning. None of those moments had seemed important alone. Together they formed the edges of a picture I had never wanted to assemble. I made one decision before the sun came up the next morning. I would not accuse him of anything until I understood exactly what I was facing. If the truth had managed to remain hidden this long, then rushing toward answers would only give it another place to hide. The following morning began exactly the way hundreds of mornings had before it. Scott left the house a little after 7 with a travel mug of coffee in one hand and his laptop over his shoulder. He smiled, wished me a good day, and reminded me that he might be home late because another client meeting had been added to his schedule. I smiled back just as naturally as I always had. After the front door closed behind him, I stood in the quiet kitchen for several minutes, listening to the silence settle over the house. It was strange how quickly ordinary routines could begin to feel like carefully rehearsed performances. I did not spend that morning searching through his belongings or looking for dramatic evidence. Instead, I opened my calendar and began writing down every business dinner, weekend meeting, and unexpected schedule change I could remember from the past 6 months. At first the list seemed random, but patterns slowly emerged. Nearly every Thursday evening had become unavailable. 2 Saturdays each month had been marked as work emergencies. There had also been 3 conferences that suddenly seemed unusually difficult to verify because he had returned home with almost no stories about them. By lunchtime I found myself opening the family computer in the home office. We had always shared certain household accounts, including utility payments, insurance records, and our joint calendar. I was not searching for secrets. I simply wanted to understand whether the life I believed we shared still existed anywhere beyond my own memory. Most of the records looked perfectly ordinary until I noticed several restaurant charges that did not match any evenings we had spent together. They were not extravagant. In fact, they were modest enough that most people would never question them. That was what made them memorable. They blended into everyday life so easily that they almost disappeared. I copied the dates onto a notepad and closed the browser without making any changes. Later that afternoon I drove to the neighborhood art store again, because I had never actually purchased my granddaughter's birthday gift. As I carried the watercolor set to the register, I realized how determined I had become to keep living my normal life while quietly collecting the truth. Fear has a way of convincing people to rush toward answers, but patience often reveals far more than panic ever could. When I returned home, I placed the wrapped gift beside the front hall table and started preparing dinner. Scott arrived shortly before 7, appearing relaxed and cheerful. He mentioned a productive meeting, complimented the smell of dinner, and asked whether I wanted to watch a movie after we ate. I agreed without hesitation. As we sat together on the living room couch, I noticed him checking his phone whenever a notification appeared, always angling the screen slightly away before slipping it back into his pocket. Months earlier I would have ignored such a small gesture. Now every quiet movement carried a different weight. I still did not know the full story, and I refused to invent one. But I had begun to understand something far more important. The truth was no longer hidden because it was impossible to find. It had remained hidden because I had never imagined I would need to look for it. 3 days passed before I learned the value of remaining quiet. If I had confronted Scott the afternoon I saw him, I would have received polished explanations and carefully prepared excuses. Instead, every ordinary day gave me another small piece of a much larger picture. On Friday morning, I stopped by our bank branch to ask a routine question about one of our savings accounts. The young teller recognized me immediately because I had been banking there for years. She answered my question politely, then mentioned that our financial advisor had recently tried to schedule a follow-up meeting regarding several investment documents. I smiled and thanked her, but something about that comment stayed with me during the drive home. Scott had never mentioned any meeting with our advisor. We had always promised each other that major financial decisions would be discussed together before anything was signed. That promise had survived almost 3 decades. At least I believed it had. After lunch, I called our advisor myself and left a simple message asking whether we could review our retirement plans together sometime the following week. I did not mention Scott. I did not ask suspicious questions. I only wanted information that belonged to both of us. The advisor returned my call less than an hour later and sounded pleasantly surprised to hear from me. He explained that he had assumed Scott had already discussed several proposed adjustments with me, because Scott had requested updated projections for their future financial plans. Future. The word echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. He had been planning something beyond business dinners and unexplained evenings. I thanked the advisor, scheduled an appointment, and carefully wrote down everything he had said before placing the notebook back inside the kitchen drawer. That evening Scott arrived home carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. He smiled as though he had planned a thoughtful surprise after a long week. We ate together, talked about our grandchildren, and laughed over an old television sitcom we had watched years earlier. Looking across the table, I realized that the hardest part was not pretending everything was normal. The hardest part was recognizing how naturally he seemed able to move between 2 completely different lives. Nothing in his voice suggested guilt. Nothing in his expression hinted at uncertainty. If I had not seen what I saw with my own eyes, I might still have believed every word he spoke. Later, while he showered upstairs, his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter where he had accidentally left it. I did not reach for it. I did not unlock it. I simply watched the screen light up before fading back to black. One notification appeared with only a first name visible. Rachel. A few seconds later another message arrived, followed by a small preview that disappeared before I could read more than a few ordinary words about meeting tomorrow. I looked away almost immediately. I did not need to invade his privacy to understand what was happening anymore. The truth was already standing in the room with me. That night I opened a new notebook and wrote one sentence across the first page. Facts only. No assumptions. No anger. No revenge. Every page after that would contain only dates, conversations, receipts, and observations that I knew were real. If my life was about to change, I wanted every decision I made to be guided by truth instead of emotion. For the first time since that afternoon in the parking garage, I felt something stronger than heartbreak. I felt clarity, and clarity is often the first quiet step toward reclaiming a life you never imagined you would have to rebuild. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. I had spent the entire weekend organizing my thoughts instead of allowing them to organize me. The notebook I had started now rested inside the top drawer of my desk, its pages slowly filling with dates, conversations, and observations that required no interpretation. Facts have a remarkable way of standing on their own when you give them enough room. At 10 o'clock, I drove to meet our financial advisor. The office overlooked Elliott Bay, and on clear mornings like this one, the water reflected enough sunlight to make the entire room feel brighter than it really was. I had visited that office many times over the years with Scott sitting beside me. This was the first time I walked in alone. Our advisor greeted me warmly and apologized for assuming Scott had already discussed the recent planning sessions with me. I smiled politely and admitted that our schedules had been unusually busy. I preferred listening over speaking. As he reviewed our retirement portfolio, several details quietly shifted my understanding of the past few months. Scott had requested updated projections based on the possibility of selling our vacation cabin within the next year. He had also asked about restructuring several investment accounts to simplify future distributions. None of those actions had actually been completed because both of our signatures were required, but the conversations themselves had taken place without my knowledge. I thanked him for explaining everything and asked for printed copies of every proposal that had been prepared. He handed them to me without hesitation, believing he was simply helping a longtime client stay informed. Driving home, I realized the woman I had seen beside Scott was no longer the center of my questions. She might have been part of the story, but she was not writing it. The decisions affecting my future had begun long before I noticed her standing beside him in that parking garage. That afternoon I stopped for coffee before returning home. While waiting for my order, I opened my notebook and compared the dates from the investment proposals with the restaurant charges I had written down several days earlier. The timeline fit together with uncomfortable precision. Meetings about financial changes often appeared within days of evenings Scott claimed he had been working late. Coincidence was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. When I arrived home, I placed the documents inside a folder labeled Household Records. It was ordinary enough that Scott would never think twice about seeing it on the bookshelf. That evening unfolded almost exactly like the ones before it. We prepared dinner together, exchanged stories about our day, and spoke with our daughter over a video call as our grandchildren proudly showed us the birdhouse they had painted that weekend. Watching Scott laugh with the children reminded me that people are rarely defined by only one part of their lives. He was still a loving father and grandfather. He had also become someone capable of keeping significant secrets from the person who trusted him most. Those two truths existed side by side whether I wanted them to or not. Before going to bed, I opened my notebook once more and added a single sentence beneath everything else I had written. The truth is revealing itself one quiet piece at a time. I no longer felt the urge to rush ahead. Whatever came next, I intended to meet it with clear eyes, steady hands, and the confidence that only honest facts can provide. The following week brought another surprise, although it was nothing like the dramatic discoveries people expect in stories like this. Instead, it arrived quietly through an ordinary envelope sitting in our mailbox. Inside was a notice regarding property tax records for our vacation cabin in the Cascade foothills. Normally I would have placed it on Scott's desk without giving it another thought, but after everything I had learned, I decided to read it carefully before setting it aside. The document itself contained no alarming news, yet it reminded me of the conversation our financial advisor had mentioned only days earlier. Scott had been exploring the possibility of selling the cabin, a place filled with nearly 3 decades of family memories, without ever mentioning it to me. I drove there the following Saturday under the simple excuse that I wanted to check on the property before autumn arrived. The winding roads, tall evergreens, and familiar lake looked exactly as they always had. Every corner of that cabin carried reminders of birthdays, fishing trips, rainy afternoons playing board games with our children, and quiet mornings drinking coffee on the porch. Standing inside the living room, I realized that memories themselves were never the problem. It was the silence surrounding the future of those memories that hurt the most. Before leaving, I opened the small filing cabinet where we kept maintenance records and insurance papers. Everything appeared neatly organized until I noticed a folder containing recent estimates from 2 different real estate agencies. The dates matched the timeline I had already been building inside my notebook. Neither estimate had been finalized, and no listing agreement had been signed, but someone had clearly been preparing for possibilities that excluded my knowledge. I carefully photographed the documents with my phone, returned every page exactly where I had found it, and locked the cabinet before driving home. That evening Scott asked whether I had enjoyed spending the day at the cabin. His question caught me off guard for only a moment. Then I remembered that I had casually mentioned my plan during breakfast. I smiled and told him the lake was beautiful as always and that the porch would probably need a fresh coat of paint before winter. He nodded, appearing relieved that our conversation remained comfortably ordinary. As we cleaned the dinner dishes together, he spoke about an upcoming conference that might require another overnight stay. His voice was steady, his expressions familiar, and for a brief moment I found myself remembering the young man I married so many years ago. It would have been easier if he had become cruel or distant overnight. Instead, he remained thoughtful in small everyday ways while keeping enormous parts of his life hidden behind polite conversations. That contrast was becoming the hardest truth to accept. Later that night, I spread my notes across the desk in my home office. Restaurant receipts, investment proposals, calendar entries, property estimates, and my own handwritten observations formed a timeline that no longer depended on guesses. I looked at every page before placing them neatly back into their folder. My questions had changed completely. I was no longer asking whether something was wrong. I already knew that. The question now was how long these plans had been unfolding without my realizing that the future I believed we were building together had quietly become a future designed for someone else. The decision to stop wondering and start preparing changed everything about the way I moved through each day. I no longer measured time by unanswered questions. Instead, I measured it by completed tasks. On Tuesday morning, I scheduled an appointment with an attorney whose name had been recommended by a longtime friend from church. I did not tell anyone where I was going. The office occupied the second floor of a quiet brick building overlooking a neighborhood park where children chased one another across the grass without the slightest awareness that adult lives could become so complicated. The attorney greeted me with kindness rather than curiosity, and for the first time in weeks I spoke honestly about what I knew instead of what I feared. I explained the unexplained meetings, the financial discussions, the restaurant receipts, and the documents connected to our vacation cabin. I was careful not to exaggerate a single detail. When I finished, she folded her hands across the desk and told me something I will never forget. Preparation is not the same as revenge. Preparation simply gives you choices when the truth finally arrives. Those words settled my mind in a way nothing else had. Before leaving, I asked her to review copies of the financial proposals and property records I had collected. She assured me that no major changes could be completed without the proper legal steps, and advised me to continue documenting only facts. Driving home, I realized I had spent too many weeks believing I was reacting to Scott's decisions. For the first time, I was making decisions of my own. That afternoon, I visited our safe deposit box at the bank. Inside were family documents, insurance policies, birth certificates, and the original deed to our home. Everything appeared untouched, but I made certified copies of every important record before returning each document exactly where it belonged. I wanted knowledge, not confrontation. Later, I stopped by a small office supply store and purchased a simple expanding file folder with 12 labeled sections. It looked ordinary enough to disappear onto any bookshelf, yet inside it I organized every note, receipt, timeline, and document I had gathered over the previous weeks. Order brought an unexpected sense of peace. Chaos thrives when everything feels scattered. Truth becomes much easier to understand when every piece has its place. That evening Scott arrived home carrying flowers for the dining room table. White lilies. My favorite. He smiled as he handed them to me and said he had seen them while driving home and thought they would brighten the house. I thanked him sincerely because the gesture itself was thoughtful. That was the strange part about living beside someone whose choices had become impossible to reconcile. Acts of kindness still existed beside acts of secrecy. Neither erased the other. After dinner we sat on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Scott talked about replacing the old fence next spring, and wondered whether we should finally renovate the upstairs bathroom. I listened quietly, realizing that he was speaking about a future while privately preparing for a different one. I did not interrupt him. I simply watched the evening light fade across the yard we had built together over nearly 3 decades. By the time I went to bed that night, I no longer felt trapped between confusion and heartbreak. I had reached something steadier than either emotion. Whatever conversation eventually came, I would enter it with calm instead of fear, because the strongest position is not built on suspicion. It is built on quiet preparation and the confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. 2 days later, I decided the waiting had served its purpose. I did not need another receipt, another calendar entry, or another quiet observation to understand the direction our lives had taken. What I needed was a conversation, but not one born out of anger. I wanted every word I spoke to be supported by certainty instead of emotion. On Friday afternoon I called Scott and suggested we have dinner together at home without distractions. I told him I wanted an evening that belonged only to us. He sounded pleasantly surprised and agreed without hesitation. I spent the afternoon preparing one of the first meals we had learned to cook together as newlyweds. The familiar aroma filled the kitchen, bringing back memories of our tiny first apartment where we had celebrated simple victories because we could not afford extravagant ones. Looking around the dining room, I realized how many years had passed between those hopeful beginnings and the quiet uncertainty sitting in front of me now. Before Scott arrived home, I placed a slim folder beside my chair. Inside were only a handful of documents, a copy of the investment proposals, the property estimates for the cabin, a list of dates that matched restaurant charges and unexplained meetings, and finally, one photograph I had printed the day before. It showed nothing dramatic. It simply captured Scott standing beside Rachel outside the restaurant, smiling as though the rest of the world had disappeared. The image had been taken from the exact place where I had stood that afternoon in the parking garage. When Scott walked through the front door, everything seemed ordinary. He complimented dinner, poured us both iced tea, and asked about my visit with our grandchildren earlier that week. I answered every question calmly. We ate slowly, speaking about familiar subjects until the plates were nearly empty. Then I folded my napkin, rested my hands on the table, and gently slid the folder across to him. He looked at it with mild curiosity before opening the cover. His expression changed almost immediately. He recognized the financial documents first. Then he reached the property estimates. Finally, his eyes settled on the photograph. The room became completely silent. He stared at the picture for several long moments before looking up at me. There was no anger in his face. There was only surprise, followed by the unmistakable realization that I had known far more than he had imagined. He opened his mouth as though searching for the right explanation, but I quietly raised one hand before he spoke. I told him that I had not gathered those documents to embarrass him or to win an argument. I had gathered them because I deserved to understand the truth about my own life. I explained that every decision represented in that folder affected both of us, yet none of them had included an honest conversation. He lowered his eyes to the table and remained silent. For the first time in weeks, I felt no need to ask questions. The evidence had already answered them. I simply told him that trust is rarely destroyed by one single mistake. It disappears piece by piece each time honesty is replaced with secrecy. The silence that followed felt different from every silence we had shared before. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with truth, and although the truth was painful, it also carried an unexpected sense of peace. Whatever happened after that evening, neither of us would ever again be pretending that everything was still the way it used to be. The days that followed our conversation were quieter than I ever imagined they would be. There were no dramatic arguments echoing through the house and no rushed decisions made in anger. Instead, there were long conversations that should have happened months earlier, perhaps even years earlier. Scott admitted that he had allowed himself to drift into a life built on omissions instead of honesty. He acknowledged that every hidden meeting, every unexplained dinner, and every financial discussion held without me had weakened the foundation we had spent decades building together. He apologized more than once, but I had already learned that apologies and trust do not travel at the same speed. One can be spoken in a single afternoon, while the other may require years to return if it ever does. Over the next several weeks, We worked through the practical matters with calm guidance from attorneys and financial advisors. We agreed that every decision would be handled respectfully, with fairness rather than resentment. The vacation cabin remained unsold. Our home was protected. Every financial record became completely transparent. Those choices did not erase the past, but they ensured that the future would no longer be shaped by hidden plans. One Saturday morning, I returned alone to the waterfront where I had often walked before life became so complicated. The air carried the familiar scent of salt water, and ferries crossed Elliott Bay just as they had for countless years. Families laughed together on the sidewalks, joggers passed with quiet determination, and children fed crumbs to curious seagulls. Watching ordinary life continue reminded me that the world does not stop because one chapter unexpectedly ends. It simply waits for us to decide how the next chapter will begin. I thought about the woman I had been only a few months earlier. She believed love meant never questioning the person beside her. Now I understood that healthy trust is not built on avoiding difficult conversations. It is built on honesty strong enough to survive them. Looking back, the moment that changed everything was not discovering a secret. It was choosing not to lose myself after discovering it. I had remained calm not because I was weak, but because I finally understood that clarity is far more powerful than panic. My dignity had never depended on someone else's choices. It depended entirely on my own. A few weeks later, our daughter invited the entire family to her home for Sunday dinner. The grandchildren filled the backyard with laughter while adults gathered around the patio table, sharing homemade food and familiar stories. As I watched those small moments unfold, I realized that life had quietly given me something unexpected. It had reminded me that my identity had never been limited to being someone's wife. I was still a mother, a grandmother, a loyal friend, and a woman capable of beginning again with confidence instead of fear. Before leaving that evening, my oldest granddaughter slipped her hand into mine and smiled without saying a word. Sometimes the people who love us most do not need long explanations. They simply remind us that we still belong exactly where we are. Driving home beneath the fading evening sky, I felt no desire to relive what had happened or imagine how differently it could have ended. Peace does not arrive when the past changes. Peace arrives when we stop allowing the past to decide who we become. That was the lesson I carried forward, and it became far more valuable than any answer I had spent so many weeks searching to find.